The first thing they noticed was the smell. Old paper and damp stone. When the wall gave way in the county records room, dust fell like snow, settling on desks that had not been moved in generations. Behind the bricks lay a narrow cavity, and inside it, a ledger bound in cracked leather, its spine stitched with thread the color of dried blood. The clerk who found it did not understand the symbols at first. Columns of dates, initials, and numbers marched down the pages with a cold precision, interrupted by phrases that sounded like blessings, but read like warnings. Transferred. Re-signed. Returned for correction. The ledger was not meant to be found, and the men who bricked it into the courthouse wall understood that time itself could be a collaborator. When the renovation crews struck stone where there should have been air, they assumed it was a forgotten support, an old patch from a careless era. Only when the wall collapsed inward did the cavity reveal its contents, wrapped in oilcloth and pressed tight, as if the bricks themselves had been instructed to remember. The book was heavier than it looked, swollen with pages that resisted being opened, as though the ink still carried a will of its own. Its cover bore no title, only a shallow impression where one might have once existed, scraped away with deliberate patience. At first glance, the entries resembled routine accounting. Dates aligned neatly with initials, sums tallied with care, and marginal notes written in a tidy, reassuring hand. But the reassurance dissolved under scrutiny. The dates did not stop where history said they should. They drifted forward, past proclamations and reforms, into decades that prided themselves on progress. The initials repeated with unsettling frequency, often followed by the same terms, softened by bureaucratic language, yet chilling in their consistency. Placement adjusted. Subject retained. Contract extended. Each phrase implied a human presence while refusing to name it. More disturbing still were the codes threaded through the ledger like a second, quieter voice. Symbols marked certain entries, small shapes that looked almost decorative until patterns emerged. A triangle appeared beside names that never reappeared. A circle marked those who were returned. Sometimes years later, their ages altered but their numbers unchanged. Cross, referencing these marks with old transportation logs and municipal budgets, revealed payments moving between institutions that publicly denied any connection. Schools, farms, charitable homes, and workshops all appeared in the margins, linked by arrows so faint they might have been mistaken for smudges. As archivists worked through the nights, the ledger began to feel less like a book and more like a map, charting a hidden economy that thrived in plain sight. The sums were small enough to escape attention, spread thin across departments, disguised as maintenance, training, or care. Yet taken together, they formed a continuous line of profit drawn from lives that could be reassigned, corrected, or erased. The most damning detail lay in the final pages, where the handwriting changed, becoming hurried but no less precise, as if the writer sensed the future pressing close and chose to trust the wall, the mortar, and the long, obedient silence of time. She came forward after the ledger was mentioned on the evening news. Her call placed just before midnight, when voices tend to soften and truths slip through more easily. The producer who answered expected confusion or curiosity, but what came through the line was memory, sharpened by decades of restraint. She did not ask if the story was real. She asked if the symbols had been shown, if the small triangle had been mentioned. And when the producer hesitated, she said that was how they'd mark the children who would not be seen again. By morning, she was sitting in a borrowed chair beneath studio lights, hands folded, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the room. She spoke without drama, as if reciting a lesson learned too well. She described being taken at an age when numbers mattered more than names, escorted by adults who smiled as though kindness were a requirement of their job. The place she was brought to had a name that suggested safety, a word parents could repeat to themselves when doubt crept in. Inside, days were measured by bells and footsteps, by the weight of keys, and the scrape of boots in the corridor. Boys and girls slept in separate wings, but learned the same rules: look down, speak when spoken to, forget the sound of your own name. What unsettled those listening was not only what she remembered, but what she said had been taught to her deliberately. They were instructed to believe they were lucky, that work was a gift, that discipline was care. Punishment, when it came, was framed as correction, never cruelty. She recalled being moved from place to place with paperwork that arrived before she did, her number already known, her file already thick. Sometimes she was told she was being helped, other times that she was being returned, as if she were an object that had failed inspection. Her voice faltered only once when she spoke of the songs. They were taught to sing while working. Melodies simple enough to hide the counting beneath them. The songs made time disappear and muffled the sounds that might have traveled beyond the walls. She said that even now, certain tunes tightened her chest, because they carried the echo of many small voices trying to become invisible together. When she finished, the room remained silent longer than any broadcast pause. The ledger had offered proof, but her testimony gave it weight and breath, transforming ink and symbols into lived hours, aching limbs, and nights spent learning how to survive by becoming forgettable. The fire began just before dawn, the hour when the town still believed itself asleep and unobserved. It started in a derelict grain store slated for demolition, a place children had been warned away from for generations. When the roof collapsed, it revealed not only charred beams, but a hollow beneath the foundation, an opening that breathed out cold air, and soot like a long-held secret finally exhaled. Firefighters widening the breach expected old drainage or animal burrows. What they found instead was a stone stair descending into darkness, its edges worn smooth by countless careful steps. Below the store ran a narrow passage reinforced with brick and timber, sloping gently toward the river. The walls bore scratches and chalk marks, some nearly erased, others renewed again and again, as if to ensure they would be seen by someone who knew how to look. Iron rings were set at intervals, their purpose unclear, until the discovery of short lengths of chain embedded in the mortar, cut flush and hidden. The passage branched, connecting to other tunnels beneath the town, some leading toward institutions, long praised for their benevolence, others toward loading docks and disused rail spurs no longer marked on modern maps. As investigators traced the routes, records that once seemed unrelated snapped into alignment. Missing children reported decades apart vanished from different neighborhoods, yet resurfaced under new names in distant counties, their paperwork stamped and filed as though the journey itself had never occurred. Old delivery schedules matched the spacing of the chalk marks, and ledger entries once thought metaphorical revealed themselves as literal instructions. The tunnels had allowed movement without witnesses, transfers conducted at night, bodies guided underground while the town slept above, unaware or unwilling to know. Residents who had lived near the routes their entire lives swore they had heard nothing, though some admitted to strange vibrations beneath their floors, a low humming that came and went. A few remembered being told not to ask questions when carts arrived late or left early, their contents covered and guarded with unusual care. The tunnels explained how entire groups could disappear without a single report filed, how boys and girls could be taken, processed, and redistributed with an efficiency that mimicked industry rather than crime. What shocked investigators most was not the existence of the tunnels, but their upkeep. Repairs had been made well into the 20th century. Bricks newer than the buildings above them, mortar still pale beneath layers of dust. Someone had maintained the routes long after they should have been abandoned, ensuring the system remained invisible and intact. The fire had not destroyed the network so much as illuminated it, turning a rumor into a physical reality that could be measured, mapped, and walked through step by step, forcing the town to confront the quiet infrastructure that had allowed children to be moved. Renamed and erased beneath its feet, the name surfaced slowly, almost reluctantly, threaded through minutes of town meetings and plaques bolted to brick walls. He was remembered as a benefactor, the sort of man whose portrait hung in hallways where visitors were encouraged to feel grateful. His donations had built wings, funded scholarships, and kept doors open during lean years. There were photographs of him breaking ground with a silver shovel, smiling beside officials who trusted him without hesitation. To speak ill of him felt like an offense against the town's own reflection, a betrayal of the story it preferred to tell itself. Yet the ledger and the tunnels pointed again and again to his signature, sometimes whole, sometimes reduced to a flourish that matched no one else's hand. Payments flowed through accounts he controlled, disguised as endowments or maintenance grants, money that arrived precisely when children were re-signed or corrected. Institutions that praised his generosity also appeared most frequently in the coded entries, their reports unusually thorough, their compliance absolute. When questioned, their records were immaculate but curiously empty, as if all the right forms had been filled with none of the necessary truth. Former employees, long retired, began to recall instructions that had once seemed ordinary. Doors were to remain locked at certain hours. Visitors were to be redirected. Questions about specific children were to be answered with rehearsed phrases. They spoke of inspections announced well in advance, of rooms cleared and scrubbed to present order where fear had lived. The benefactor's visits were remembered with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He walked the corridors with an air of ownership, masked as concern, addressing children by numbers he claimed were easier to remember, reminding staff that discipline was a form of love. What made the revelation unbearable was how effectively charity had been used as camouflage. The public saw meals served, beds provided, skills taught. They did not see the punishments framed as training, the labor extracted under the promise of care, the contracts signed on behalf of children too young to understand their meaning. By funding everything from uniforms to textbooks, the benefactor ensured gratitude flowed outward, while accountability dissolved inward. His reputation shielded him, turning suspicion into ingratitude and silence into loyalty. When his foundation's archives were finally opened, correspondence confirmed what the survivors had long known. He understood the system intimately and refined it, using influence to smooth over obstacles and redirect scrutiny. His legacy, once celebrated in stone and bronze, now appeared as a carefully constructed mask, one that allowed control to pass for compassion and exploitation to wear the face of mercy, sustained not by cruelty alone, but by the town's willingness to accept gifts without asking what they truly cost. The final proof did not arrive with a confession or a dramatic arrest, but through a stack of policy memos that had been misfiled for decades, their significance buried beneath neutral language and official seals. These documents outlined a narrow administrative exception originally drafted to address juvenile vagrancy and protective custody that allowed local authorities to place minors into long-term institutional supervision without parental consent under specific conditions. On paper, it appeared temporary and humane, a safeguard for troubled times. In practice, it became a door that never fully closed, widened by interpretation and kept ajar by those who benefited from what passed through it. The loophole relied on categorization, rather than chains. Children labeled as wards, dependents, or corrections cases could be transferred between facilities without triggering criminal review. Oversight was delegated to committees that met infrequently and recorded less. As long as basic provisions were reported and minimal education claimed, the placements were deemed lawful. No one asked how long a child remained, how often they were moved, or why their names changed. The system required no explicit cruelty to function, only the steady application of rules that treated children as cases instead of people. What extended the practice into the 1940s was not ignorance but convenience. The language of emergency lingered long after the emergency itself had faded, and wartime priorities further diluted scrutiny. Labor shortages reframed forced work as contribution. Discipline became patriotism. Any challenge could be dismissed as unhelpful or disloyal. Officials who inherited the policy followed precedent rather than conscience, signing off on placements because they always had, because the paperwork was clean, because no one above them asked differently. When legal scholars reconstructed the framework, they found that abolishing slavery had not dismantled every mechanism that enabled it, only the most visible ones. This system survived by aligning itself with bureaucracy, by nesting inside regulations meant to protect, and by exploiting the gap between law and lived reality. It required silence more than violence, routine more than spectacle. Each signature extended its life a little further, each unchecked form another year added to its reach. The revelation forced a reckoning, not just with the past, but with the nature of complicity. The system endured because it did not announce itself as evil. It spoke the language of order, care, and necessity, and in doing so, it convinced generations that what was happening was unfortunate, but permissible. By the time the loophole was finally closed, thousands of childhoods had already passed through it, their years accounted for in files and memos that treated endurance as compliance and survival as consent,